I think the one message that I really want people to understand is I think we should all ask for more. So I think there's this very convenient narrative that's been perfectly crafted by Silicon Valley that says either you have to give us all of your data so you can benefit from the amazing products and services and get all the convenience that technology has to offer. But for that, you have to give up your privacy and your self-determination, everything. And I just don't think that's true anymore.
That's the voice of Sandra Matz, a psychology and data researcher at Columbia University's Business School, who has spent most of her professional career researching behavioral residue.
Okay. All right, Tim, excuse me, but what? What the hell is behavioral residue?
Okay,
sounds like something I don't want to look at in the toilet. That's all I have to say.
Just don't get it on your feet. or your hands, I guess, for that matter. Behavioral residue is a term that psychologists use to describe the stuff that we churn through in our lives. It's in the old days, behavioral residue would show up like as bills piled up on our desk, or the stuff in our garbage, or concert tickets stubs, left over from the night before, or maybe the paper map of the national park that we were planning on hiking through. That's sort of the analog equivalent to what modern day digital residue is.
But Sandra's not researching that old-fashioned stuff, is she?
No, not at all. I mean, she's looking at the digital versions of these old paper-based things, these analog things. And you might have heard terms like digital exhaust or digital breadcrumbs or digital footprints, and they're all side effects from our life in the digital world.
Okay. So you're talking about the data that is generated when we log into a website, scroll through items on the shopping website that we're going to, using our GPS to navigate to the Kentucky Fried Chicken or to wherever, or even the CT or CCTV, right? I think that's what it is. Footage when we're in public places. All of those countless transactions with retailers, in the public, the phone calls, texts, emails, everything that happens is now part of this behavioral residue?
Yeah. It just going through that list, it's kind of overwhelming. Yeah, there is a lot. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and you just have to look at recent news of, things going on in the world, and it's crazy what we find. And so there's not just a lot, but we go through our days without even realizing how much digital residue we leave behind. In fact, and this is a fun, interesting piece, on average, we generate 6 gigabytes of data, not every day, but every hour, Tim. Every hour.
You said every hour? Every hour we generate 6 gigabytes of data?
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, wow. Here's the other thing that makes our digital residue different from the old paper stuff. It lasts forever. So 30 years ago, I could go pay cash for tickets to a Depeche Mode or a Debbie Gibson concert.
You would never go to a Debbie Gibson concert.
See, you wouldn't know that. But, this is the thing, because I could go to the show. If I didn't tell anybody, I could throw the ticket stubs away and no one would be the wiser, right? No one would be the wiser. But today, I can't do that. So if I decided to go to Depeche Mode and everybody knew it, that's fine, because that fits with who I am, right? But if I went to a Debbie Gibson concert, man, I don't know. I mean, that version of my digital record out there, because I paid with my credit card. There's CCTV of me going in. They have my GPS as I'm going to that concert. It's out there, and it lasts not just a day, not just 2 days, not a year, not 10 years, forever, Tim, forever. Ever. That's the, yeah.
You're painting kind of a grim picture here, buddy.
I'm sorry. That's the world that we live in, and it scares the hell out of me.
Okay, let's get back to Sandra. Well, she is both a technologist and a psychologist, and she's interested in the impact of collecting and using all of this stuff, all of this digital residue, for better or for worse, on human decision making.
Welcome to Behavior Grooves, the podcast that explores our human condition. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. In our conversation with Sandra, we discussed her book, Mind Masters, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior. We explored the use of data that gets collected through our digital breadcrumbs to predict and influence our behavior. Sandra shared a study in which personalized ads that were created with highly targeted digital data increased purchases by 50%. And she has some cool ideas on how digital data can be used to improve mental health and savings habits as well.
Right. But as you can imagine, there's a downside too. And she highlighted some of the ethical implications of using data for just about any purpose, starting with Google. Your browser literally has an eye on every search, every mouse click, and every hover that we do. And that data generated from all those transactions can create an incredibly accurate personality profile, better than we might have ourselves or our spouses or friends even know about us. And those profiles can be used, if it's getting in the wrong hands, to manipulate us.
Absolutely. Now, fortunately, Sandra has a sense of optimism about what we can do about all this. She talks about the importance of understanding how behavioral residue can be used for good, like creating data co-ops that could benefit the collective well-being of many people, where all the good aspects of using data to make our lives easier actually benefits us, but without the privacy concerns. It's going to be a cool conversation.
And as you heard her say at the top of the episode, she believes we can have more control over our personal data and still enjoy the benefits that technology brings to us. And to get here, we need better regulation of the way that data gets stored and used, but that's not an insurmountable task.
No, we should note that you're going to hear some terms during our conversation with Sandra that might be unfamiliar to you. So Kurt and I are actually going to sort of pull you off the superhighway of conversation from time to time, take a little detour, and we're going to take an explanatory pit stop so that nobody gets lost.
Okay, that is an interesting mix of metaphors there, Mr. Houlihan. Super highway of conversation. All right, I like it. There you go.
I'm just trying to keep things fresh. Okay, groovers. So with that, we hope that you sit back and relax with a warm winter's brew and enjoy our conversation with Sandra Matz. Sandra Matz, welcome back to Behavioral Grooves.
Well, thank you so much for having me back.
It's such a pleasure to see you and to be talking about this wonderful new book that you have. But we're going to start with a speed round, and we want to find out first, would you prefer to live in a big city or a small village?
Big city.
Big city.
Well,
you grew up
in a
small town, so
yeah, right? And I left for a reason.
Oh, okay.
There's that. I ended up in New York, so I think that one fell more towards the big city side.
Yeah, that's a big city. That's not even a little city. That's a big one. All right, Sandra, if you could have one superpower for 1 hour, what would that superpower be? And it's only an hour,
it's only an hour.
Yeah.
I would love to know everything about the universe, all the questions that we don't have answers to. I think I would want to know how consciousness works, free will, how did the universe start? I think, and then in this 1 hour, I get everything and I can use it for the rest of my life. That would be a great superpower for 1 hour.
Wow.
I think that would be painful. I mean, all of that information coming into your brain that fast. I mean, I do think that is an amazing piece, though, of being able to understand some of those, the mysteries of the universe, as you say, and being able to understand that would be, wow. I might go for that one myself if it didn't hurt too much with my brain, limited brain, put it all in there.
I'll let you know how it goes.
All right. Let me know.
I just have to say, I think it's the best answer to that question that I've ever heard. That has altered the way I think about that question now for the rest of my life. So thank you for that. Okay, third speed round question. True or false? Algorithms with the right data are better at predicting behaviors than people are.
Leading question. I'll take that one.
Good.
I think It's probably a yes. Essentially, this, right? I mean, there's so much that we can understand about ourselves, that we can understand about other people, because evolution has made us really good at being attuned to what are other people going to do in the next moment. But algorithms are just insane at capturing so much data about us and then integrating all of that data into their predictions. So I think that round would go to the algorithm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about that. I'm sure we will get into that. All right. So, Sandra, our very last speed round question, and this one might be a lead in as well, is using a lot of first person pronouns like I, me, or myself online and social media a sign of being a narcissist or of emotional distress?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite findings, I think, of all times, because it's such a surprising one. So this is research done by Jamie Pennebaker at Austin. And I think when I first saw him present, it was like, well, here's like some people are using first person pronouns, right? I, me, more often than others. What do you guys think? And this is like a room, remind you, like of psychologists. So he's talking to an audience of like people who study this stuff. And he poses the question. I'm like, I think it's narcissism. Like, what else could it be, really? Like, this is people talking about themselves all the time. They're the center of attention. I was like so sure it was narcissism. And then it turned out, and this has been replicated now time and again, that it's actually a sign of essentially mental health challenges, distress, emotional distress, as you mentioned, sign of depression. And when I first heard about this, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, why would people who are depressed talk more about themselves? And then Jamie explained it, and I was like, oh my God, this is now looking back so obvious. Because you can imagine if you're not doing well, right, it's really hard to think about how to solve the world's problems. You're probably not going to think about how am I going to solve climate change. What you really think about is like, I'm doing really poorly. How do I get out of that?
Yeah.
And like, what am I going to do? So like the way that you focus on the self and the way that you turn inward when you suffer from depression, for example, obviously also means that you kind of write more about yourself and you talk more about yourself and you think more about yourself. So it's one of these findings that I thought were fascinating, and what was really kind of showing how we can learn something about human psychology just by looking at data.
Yeah, it was interesting for me because, as you said, it didn't match with my expectations. When you wrote it in the book, I'm like, oh no, that's a narcissist. Of course it is. You know, you're talking I at me, and then to really peel that back and to find out, no, that's not. And I think what you bring up is that part of looking at the data and being able to have this huge data set of different pieces and the power of what that can do for our understanding around human behavior. So, so we're here to talk to you about your book, Mind Masters, the data-driven science of predicting, the data-driven, science of predicting and changing human behavior. And help us understand a little just by telling our listeners what they might expect about this book when they read it.
Well, more than happy to. It's like really, I've poured so much hard blood into this book, as you can imagine. I think probably most people who write books do that. But the goal of writing it was really trying to, in a way, tell the human story of data, right? We oftentimes hear it in the very abstract. We hear about it in like a technology sense, but like, what about the people behind the data? And really trying to explain some of the like technologies like machine learning, AI, psychological targeting in a way that people can relate to it, and to make it in a way relevant to everybody. And it's funny because I didn't start writing with the idea or with having a book in mind. I started writing these small stories for my parents and my friends, because I was like, how do I tell them like how do I make it interesting for them to follow the work that I'm doing instead of just giving them the papers that I don't think are super interesting for people who are not in academia.
Yes.
I was like, how do I make it somewhat more enticing for them to care about the stuff that I do? And maybe also, how do I help them care about their personal data a little bit more than I think they did before they read the stories? So I started to do kind of these tiny stories. And then I think at some point, I just realized, look, there's like this narrative that's running through all of these stories, and they're kind of building the story of like, well, to what extent can algorithms learn something about our psychology just by observing behavior, then what does it mean for us, right? If someone can peek into your psychology just by looking at your data, what power does that give algorithms? And then finally, this part of like, okay, if algorithms actually do have power to change our behavior for better or worse, how should we be thinking about this? And how do we take back some of this control? So my experience of growing up in this tiny village was really that everybody knew all of your business, right? So they knew exactly who you're dating, what you do on the weekends, whether you get good grades in school. And on some level, that just kind of gives people a lot of insights into who you are, right? It's not just observing your behavior. It's not just that my neighbors constantly saw me running to the bus in the morning and sometimes miss it. I think they figured out pretty quickly that that's maybe a sign of me being not super organized and maybe not as conscientious as I sometimes try to pretend I was. So for me, this idea that neighbors make inferences about who I am by observing my behavior then translates into what we experience right now, where algorithms in some way kind of go through the same exercise, right? They observe your behavior, they look at everything that you post on social media, they track your smartphone GPS records, like what you spend with your credit card. Pretty much everything that you do in your life leaves this record. And algorithms, the same way that my neighbors then made inferences about who I was, make these same inferences about who we are just algorithmically.
And at the same time, it's a little different because the behavioral residue that gets collected online remembers everything forever, basically. Whereas in a small village of Würgesheim, that was people would forget some things. They would prefer some data over others, right?
And it's also local, right? So one of the things, like, how you say, like, what happens in a village stays in the village, that very much used to be true back in the day, right? The worst case, it goes to the next village and maybe the one next, right? So, but the extent to which gossip travels was somewhat limited. If I did something as a kid that was or teenager, absolutely horrendous, I could have always left. I could have left to a bigger city. I could have left to a different country. That's just not an option anymore, right? It's not just that we collect all of this data. It's both that it's permanent and it's completely global.
Right. Can you explain to our listeners what behavioral residue is and then how it manifests itself in the digital world in your research and others compared to the physical world?
Yeah, more than happy to. So the way that I think psychologists think about all of the traces that we leave, both in the offline and online world, falls in like two broad categories. One is identity claims. So those are all of the signals that we intentionally send, right? So as a teenager in the village, I might have dyed my hair a certain way, or I might have like had a bumper sticker on my car to signal to everybody in the village, this is who I want to be, and this is how I want to be seen. Same in the online world. So most of the stuff that we post on media is a very clear signal of like, look at me, here's who I am, this is the person that I want you to think I am. But that's only part of the story. So I think a lot of the media that we see around like personal data focuses on that part because it's so obvious. But we forget that pretty much everything that we do is data, right? So the fact that you carry your smartphone with you 24/7 just leaves an insane number of what we call behavioral residue. So this is all of the traces that you don't explicitly leave, but just by interacting with technology, they just create a record, right? It could be your GPS records. So suddenly you have a longitude, latitude that is continuously tracked. And you can make inferences like, where do you live? Where do you work? Who do you meet potentially? That's two phones showing up in the same place at the same time, and many, many more. And I think that's something that people oftentimes forget when they think about data, right? It's like we think about these very obvious identity claims that we put out there, like the pictures that we take, but most of it is actually like when we swipe our credit card, we don't really think about this. When we use our phone, we don't really think about this. The fact that there's so many cameras out there now capturing pretty much every move that we make, we don't really think about this. And so those are all these kind of behavioral residue that we just leave, and that can tell about as much about who we are on the inside as these more explicit identity claims.
As you lay all these sources of data out here, Sandra, it just makes me think about conversations that I've had with some people that make a claim or have a belief that there is a global cabal that is actually aggregating all of this data on us. And I was wondering, can you just sort of speak to that? To what degree is CCTV data combined with your phone's GPS data, combined with your shopping online data, combined with the phone conversation, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about that theory that there's like this one global entity that is collecting everything, but I think it's kind of speaks to a very important point. I think Roger McNamee, he was one of the early investors in Facebook. He has like his seventh law is that data gets exponentially more valuable when you combine it. And the way that I think about this in the context of human data is essentially you get all of these puzzle pieces, right? So you kind of have one puzzle piece of your identity that's your social. That's how you want to be seen. That's how you talk to your friends. That's how you portray your life in a maybe somewhat idealized way. But then you have other data pieces, right? And that could be, go back to the example of me being somewhat less conscientious and slightly more disorganized. If I really wanted to, maybe I could try and be a more organized person on Facebook, right? Maybe I could talk about how I make plans for the future and da 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 da. But that's only such a small piece, right? The moment that you look at my credit card spending, for example, as another puzzle piece, you see that I'm at the deli 5 times a day because I can't even plan for the afternoon when I go shopping in the morning. And you also see that my phone constantly dies, which is actually one of the empirical relationships that are highly associated with low levels of conscientiousness. So if you wanted to consistently pretend that you're someone who's extremely organized, it's almost impossible because like once you put all of these pieces together, that's when this image of the person behind the data really emerges. So that's, I think, why combining all of these data traces together is exponentially more valuable, also exponentially more dangerous.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different pieces from that I'd love to kind of dig into more. One is in the book you talk about, and you're bringing it up here, is with all of these little inferences from the social media, but also all the other points of data that you can collect, you can do a pretty good job at identifying personality styles and various different pieces of that. But you also talk about in the book about situational impacts, and that was really interesting for me because well, I'll let you explain a little bit. Both, can you talk a little bit about how do researchers, how do companies use this information to identify personality components, but then also the situational aspects that go into that?
Yeah, and I think that's it's a great question because it really ties directly into the way that psychologists, I think, now conceptualize personality, right? So it used to be the case that we thought about personality as this relatively static one-time snapshot of who you are. So it would be, well, maybe you're kind of score higher on extroversion, maybe a little bit lower on conscientiousness, higher on agreeableness, but it was a relatively static view of personality.
Okay, Tim, I think we should clarify what she means by personality at this point.
That's a good call, Kurt. Sandra goes through a quick list of personality traits, and she mentions extroversion, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. These are the foundational elements in what psychologists refer to as, oftentimes at least, as the big 5 personality traits.
Yeah, it's called the Big Five, or sometimes referred to as OCEAN, OCEAN, because it has these 5 components. And the 3 that Sandra mentioned, again, extroversion, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. But there are 2 others with this as well. That's openness and neuroticism. And the Big Five have been pretty much the gold standard for personality testing in psychological circles since roughly about the 1980s. But they really didn't catch on online or in popular culture until the late 90s or 2000s. It's actually what I used in my dissertation. I used the Big Five. There you go.
How about that? So when Sandra mentions openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, or neuroticism, which is all part of the acronym for OCEAN, right? She's talking about the Big Five personality test. Back to Sandra.
And there's always been this debate going on between the personality psychologists and social psychologists, where personality psychologists was, well, our behavior is determined by these relatively stable dispositions, your personality traits, and then all of the social psychologists would be like, no, 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 no. It's all about the situation. We can take two people, put them in the same situation, and they're going to behave in exactly the same way. So the way that we think about personality right now is almost like a hybrid of the two. At least that's how I think about this. And the way that it's been conceptualized by William Fleeson is essentially a distribution of personality states. So you can imagine that, let's take me, for example. Most of the time, I'm somewhat more introverted, but that the extent to which I'm introverted very much depends on the context, right? If I'm socializing with friends, I'm having a good time, I'm out and about in a bar, I probably feel more extroverted than I typically feel. If I'm home alone by myself and the only thing that I have is me and my thoughts, I probably feel more introverted. So if you kind of took, let's say, 1,000 samples of how extroverted I feel in the moment, you would get this distribution. And the mean of that distribution is what we typically thought of as like a personality trait. But it's also acknowledging that depending on which situation we are in, like the activities that we engage in, who we are around, we can fluctuate from that mean. And so I think where we've come to, where we started the journey of predicting personality from digital footprints rather than self-reports, was really the more static version. So we just took someone's social media profile or someone's entire spending records. We build a model that says, okay, to what extent is liking Gaga related to extroversion? Okay, you like Lady Gaga, you're an extroverted person. So very much the static view. And I think what we can do now with some of these data traces that are just much more continuous and just capture momentary situational factors like your smartphone, right? I can see whether you might be surrounded by other people by tapping into your microphone. Maybe there's conversation. Maybe you're in a current location. I pick up that you're at the coffee shop around the corner and I know that at 4 p.m. it's buzzing. So you're probably in a social setting right now. So now I can kind of take your average of the distribution and say, well, kind of social setting, let's just adjust it and assume that she's a bit more extroverted than usual. So I think even with the data sources that we capture these days, we can move more and more towards this more dynamic view of personality.
Yeah, you're talking about the big five. You're talking about when you're referring to like openness and agreeableness and conscientiousness. Was the big five sort of always at the heart of the psychological profiling? Was that an early anchor?
And it's a great question. So the reason for why I think most of the research that we have right now is focused on the big five, but not necessarily because it's the best model out there, right? So the big five is actually extremely helpful because it explains behavior, affect, and cognition across a whole range of different contexts. So if you want to have like a good idea, like a baseline idea of like who someone is, big five is great because it works across a whole bunch of contexts. Now, it doesn't mean that it's always the most helpful one, right? If you think about, can we predict, let's say, mental health, you would probably not go for the big five. If you want to try and influence and treat mental health challenges, you would probably also not go for the big five because there's other dimensions that are closer to like your emotional life. So I think we started with a big five because that's where like a lot of the research sits and where we had data initially. But I think by now we know that, and in the beginning, that was honestly surprising. But I think by now we know that pretty much anything that you want to predict, whether that's intelligence, big five personality, again, cognitive styles, or prevention versus promotion focus, whatever you take, you can predict from the data that we create.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book that the people who were interested in your work to begin with were marketing firms. Why were marketing firms early adopters of this work and these insights? And what is it about marketing that brought this work to life?
Yeah, I remember that very vividly. But actually, I think for that, it's helpful to go back to the village because
Okay.
like what we've talked about so far is essentially what villages were able to do is they observe your behavior and then they make inferences about who you are. But that's not where they stopped, right? So my experience of the village was not that they were just poking around in my private life. They were in the business of trying to push me in a certain direction. So they were trying to not just to read from my mind, they were trying to write into my mind and influence the choices that I made about who to date, what to do on the weekend, and so on. And sometimes that was amazing, right? Sometimes that was incredible because there was this community that knew what I wanted, knew my preferences, knew my motivations, and they were there to support, to give advice in a way that I've never really experienced after. So even though I said in the beginning that I probably prefer living in a big city, that was certainly an element of the village that was pretty unique and also pretty remarkable, but also can be super annoying, right? So sometimes they give good advice because you want it, and sometimes they just try to pull the strings behind your back in a way that you don't want. But really, the point here is that the intelligence that they collected by observing my behavior about who I was on the inside, they then used to change my behavior. And I think that is true for the marketing context as well. So when I started and when my colleagues had really just started this research on we can take someone's digital footprints, turn it into predictions of who we are in terms of our psychology, what I was intrigued by, I was like, well, what does it mean? Right? Like the so what question of like, okay, I can know that you're extroverted or introverted, more neurotic or more emotionally stable. What does it mean? What power does that give others? My initial thought, I should say, was to look at this in the context of healthcare. I was like, oh my God, it's amazing. If I know what someone's struggling with, what someone wants and needs, maybe I can get people to take their medication, to exercise more, eat more healthily. That totally didn't take off. I don't think anyone wanted the advice of like a 23-year-old first-year PhD student who thought you could revolutionize healthcare in the UK.
Big miss. I'm just going to say.
I know.
Big miss.
But the marketing world was really excited, right? So once they heard about the opportunity, you can predict people's preferences, needs, motivations, aspirations based on their data and potentially change their behavior as a function of that. They were like, well, that's what we've been talking about for years now. This idea that you want to understand the customer is like this mantra of like target the right customer with the right product and right message at the right time. That seemed to perfectly resonate with this idea that we can now peek into people's psychology. So that's the context that we started, really trying to show that once I understand who you are in terms of your psychology, I can also influence your behavior.
Give us an example.
Yeah, so one of the first examples was essentially a beauty retailer in the UK that we teamed up with. And their goal was to, in this case, only women, click on an ad on Facebook, go to the website and buy something. So the product, in a way, they were agnostic. They were like, I don't care if she buys the lipstick or the mascara. They're just going to buy something from the store. So what we tried to do was essentially, again, saying, well, we can target people who are more extroverted or introverted on Facebook. And the way that we did this was essentially saying we know that certain interests are related to extroversion and certain interests are related to introversion. So extroverts, for example, on Facebook, they like all of the stuff, the outgoing stuff. They like parties, kind of like think of like TV shows that you can imagine are extroverted. Entourage is one of them. Those ones. And then the introverts were targeted based on something like computers, manga, reading. So now we have these audiences. And again, some of these relationships I think are like make so much sense, right? They have like amazing face validity. So it makes sense that extroverts would like all of the social stuff and introverts, all of the more quiet and reserved stuff. But like once you can do that on Facebook, you can essentially say, well, give me an audience, give me a group of people, of users who are connected to at least one of these interests. So in this case, I'm not taking Tim's entire profile and I run it through an algorithm and I predict that he's more introverted. Hypothetically.
Of course, just hypothetically, yes.
In this case, I'm really only saying, well, just give me a group of people who are connected to at least one of these likes. And by doing that, I define my extroverted and introverted audiences. And then we had a team of creative copywriters and graphic designers just come up with content that spoke to more extroverted women and more introverted women. So you imagine you have the extroverted ads that would have like a woman on the dance floor. There's many people around, very much saturated colors. The copy would say something like, dance like no one's watching, but they totally are. So you're playing with the need of extroverts to be the center of attention.
Wow.
Now you feel much better about yourself, Tim. Now that we just talked about this. But then the introverted ones, they would just like one woman in front of the mirror, much more quiet and reserved setting. And the copy would say something like, beauty doesn't have to shout. So the idea was really that again, we kind of using the same product. We're just changing the way that we're framing it, the way that we're advertising it, the way that we're trying to make it relevant to different personality traits. And what we saw in this initial study was that if you kind of target the matching ads to matching personalities, you see an about 50% increase in how often women actually bought something from the beauty retailer, and that totally translated into a return on investment. So it was very clear that even with a very crude way of targeting, right, and a very kind of not involved way of customizing the entire journey, the only thing that they saw was like one customized ad on Facebook, you could still see like a pretty significant jump in getting the behavior that you wanted to see. And for me, this is really just the starting point of saying, well, if we can get people to buy more things based on their personality, once we understand and tap into their psychology, there's probably other behaviors that we can change.
Hey, this is Kurt, and we want to say thanks for listening to Behavioral Grooves. And we hope that you're enjoying this episode, but it feels a little bit one-sided. You're hearing from us, but we're not hearing from you.
This is Tim, and we have 2 suggestions to remedy that. The first is join our Facebook page and engage with us.
We want to talk with you. We want to hear your perspectives, and hopefully our Facebook page might be the place to have some of that interaction. So please come and join us.
The other recommendation we have for you is to leave us a quick rating. You know, the little 5-star thing at the bottom of your app? Or a short review. Just leave us a few words about what you like about behavioral groups. We'd very much appreciate it.
Thanks, and we now return you to our regularly scheduled programming. Yeah, that's it. It blows my mind. The 50% increase by just being able to do the psychological targeting, various different things. The other piece was one of the indicators of introversion, I think, was Terry Pratchett, which I'm like going, wow, there, you get really specific on some of those. But can you give us some of the implications of this work? How is it impacting us today? Because that was, as you said, pretty crude, crude being not a great word for that, but you weren't necessarily digging into all of the behavioral residue that is out there. It was very kind of rudimentary in that fact. Today, I'm assuming that is much more sophisticated for many, many things. How is that impacting us today? How is it being used? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, very much so. So I think the first thing that I should note is that I do think that the latest developments in AI have actually changed it quite dramatically, right? So when I was working with a beauty retailer, for example, we were mostly limited by the fact that they could only come up with so many different ads. So the reason for why once they clicked on the ad, went to the website, looked again the same for everybody was just a human limitation. Now you could customize with just a few clicks the entire journey, right? If I give ChatGPT, and we have a recent paper on this, if I tell it, write me an iPhone ad for someone who's extroverted, create me a political speech advocating for climate action for someone who scores high on the moral foundation of loyalty, it does an exceptional job. So the extent to which we could probably improve on the effectiveness of this type of targeting has just grown exponentially with generative AI.
We want to interrupt here because the term moral foundations was mentioned. And like the Big Five references, moral foundations are kind of, Tim, a big deal.
Yeah, Kurt. Several years ago, psychologists Jonathan Haidt and Craig Joseph and Jesse Graham came up with a model that suggested that a lot of our behaviors, beliefs, and preferences can be traced back to 5 pillars they called moral foundations. Now, what makes it particularly powerful is that they found that these foundations exist in varying degrees in virtually every person and in every culture on Earth.
Right. Now, we're not going to explain all of them here, but the 5 foundations are basically the building blocks of morality. They're the underpinnings for our behaviors, our preferences, and our beliefs. Every person has them. However, the individual mix of those foundations varies like fingerprints. So yours is going to be different than mine, which is going to be different than all of the different listeners that we have out there. And one of the amazing things about moral foundations is that your foundations can reliably point to whether you're a liberal or a conservative. And that's pretty amazing stuff. Okay, let's get back to our conversation.
Now, for me, there's actually these two sides to it. Again, a little bit similar to The Village. In The Village, some of it was amazing, and I'm happy to talk about, I think, the positives in a second. But also some of it was not that great, right? And for me, I think it's not so much just a question of privacy. I think much of the conversation that you see on the media that people have when it comes to personal data is like, well, we're worried about our privacy. And I am too, so don't get me wrong. But I think that's almost the lesser of the two evils, because the other one is you're not just losing your privacy, you're losing your ability to make your own choices, right? So the same way in the Village, people try to get me to act in a certain way. Like the beauty retailer now just sold me a product that maybe I would have bought otherwise as well, but maybe not, right? So I think the moment that someone can tap into your psychology and kind of pull the strings behind your back, they take away some of your agency, they take away some of your like self-determination. And I think now the question is, to what extent are we still making our own choices in our life, and to what extent are we still really at the wheel of our lives?
Okay, let's talk about the positive stuff. I don't want to dwell too much on the dark side.
So the positives for me is actually super important, because I think it's very easy to get sucked into the negatives, right? Because they're real, and I think I want people to care about them. But there's also this huge other side, and I've been thinking about this in a sense of like what if questions. And it started actually with the opposite side of the beauty retailer study in a way. So much of my early work, and as you said, was like in the context of marketing, and it was trying to get people to buy more stuff by tapping into their psychology. So one of the early questions that I had for myself was like, okay, if I can get people to spend more money, could I use the same strategy to get people to save more, right? So we know that saving is incredibly hard. We all have the best intentions. Like I think 30% of people, as their New Year's resolution, say they want to save more. Almost nobody manages to do it. So there is like a huge potential to help people accomplish the goals that they set for themselves. So this is a study that we did in collaboration with Save a Life, which is an amazing fintech company trying to help low-income individuals save more. And so the goal that we set for ourselves was to get people with very, very low levels of saving. So this was like people with less than $100 in saving. And what we try to do is over the course of 4 weeks, encourage them to save an additional $100. So that's, again, it might not sound too much to some of the listeners here, but that's a lot. It's like doubling your savings over the course of 4 weeks. And the way that we did this was very similar to the beauty retailer. So we kind of sampled personality. In this case, we actually used surveys. So it was all consent opt-in from the user side. And then we just came up with messaging that was tailored to people's personalities, right? Again, you can imagine that if you're talking to extroverts, you might want to emphasize that if you put some money to the side right now, here's what you can take your friends out, you can go on these amazing adventures. And this was times of COVID. So I think we just kind of gave people this image of like, once this is over, here's what you can do, and here's how you can get your social life back. And then for the introverts, it would be something like, well, just make your home more comfortable, right? If you put some money to the side right now, you can invest it in something that helps you make the most of your me time. Another interesting one that came out of some of the earlier work that I had done is agreeableness. So that's one of the personality traits that distinguishes between people who are more trusting, caring, empathetic, and people are more critical and competitive. And what we knew from prior research is that agreeable people have a hard time saving. So they have higher levels of debt, higher levels of default, and lower levels of savings. And the reason, what we kind of discovered in the research, is that they say they just don't care as much about money. And which I think comes from this almost like false dichotomy that we have, where like you can either care about people or you can care about money, which is obviously not true, because sometimes you need money to care for the people that you love.
Right,
and that's exactly what we try to get across in the message, right? So we said like, well, put some money to the side right now so you can make sure that your loved ones are going to be okay now and in the future. And what we showed is that I think very similar to the beauty retailers, like about a 60% increase in people who actually managed to save those $100 over the course of 4 weeks compared to the best performing message that Save Life had come up with until that point. If you go to the Upper East Side in New York, you're probably going to find a therapist. You're probably going to find more than one.
Yeah, right.
Very expensive therapist, by the way, too.
Yeah, so, yes. But not in Queens.
Exactly. So it's not just like, think about accessibility, right? It's not even like you need a therapist. It's also really freaking expensive. Yep. So this idea that we could potentially use data to not only track mental health. So some of my own research has looked at, can we use your smartphone, for example, to detect early signs of depression? So if you're not leaving the house as much anymore, you're not making and taking as much calls anymore, there's much less physical activity, might be nothing, right? Maybe you're just on vacation, but maybe it's an early sign of depression. And now, even for those people who can't afford a therapist, maybe there's ways in which we can recommend stuff to them that we know is most likely to work. You can think of it as like a Netflix algorithm for mental health, right? So Netflix tries and figure out, here's what you want, and here's the next movie that I'm going to recommend. We could do the same thing in healthcare and say, based on everything that we know about you, here's the best possible treatment to get you out of this valley that you're currently in. So I think healthcare is an interesting one. And then probably my favorite, which I've been fighting for years, maybe one day it's going to materialize. But it's actually what I think of as echo chamber swaps. So when I think it's a brilliant idea. I've been trying to talk to Google, Facebook for a long time. So far, nothing. Maybe someone is listening. I would greatly appreciate if you at least consider it.
Well,
Here's
what is it?
Yeah,
exactly.
What is the echo chamber? Swap.
So, I mean, like, if you think about like algorithms and recommendations and personalization, right, most of the time that appears in the context of echo chambers, where we're just kind of based on everything that you've done before, based on who we think you are, we're going to recommend content that matches that perfectly. So we're going to keep you in your little filter bubble. We're just going to show you more of the stuff that you already know. And by doing so, we also kind of splinter society a little bit because we're becoming more and more polarized. Now, the question is, could we use the same predictive algorithms in a way to allow us to hop into the echo chambers of other people and thereby expanding our view on the world in a way that we've never really been able to do? So I think that the example that I always give is, if I wanted to know what the reality of a 50-year-old Republican farmer in Ohio looks like, it would be incredibly hard for me, right? So I would have to go there, I would have to find people, I would have to kind of see what their life looks like. Almost nobody has the opportunity to do that. But Google knows exactly what the reality of that person looks like.
Yeah.
Facebook knows exactly what the reality of that person looks like. So they could give me an explorer mode on the newsfeed or on the Google searches that allows me to not just kind of say, I don't want my personalization, just give me something random, but they could let me hop into the echo chamber of a person who I specify the traits of, right? So I could say, well, just show me the search results for immigration, for something that I care about. What do they look like for someone, again, who lives in rural Ohio and lives a life that I've never been able to see before? And I think that's an opportunity that we've never had in human history, right? We couldn't just hop outside of our own skin and hop into the skin of someone else. Now, in a way, the fact that these tech companies know all of this stuff is an incredible opportunity. And I think the most common response that I get is like, well, but nobody would use it because it's so comfortable in our own echo chambers. Yeah, maybe, right? Maybe 95% of the time, I also wouldn't use it because it's very comfy and it's very convenient to find what I want on page 1 of Google. But just give me the option, right? Who are you to say that I would never use it? Maybe before an election, whatever. Like maybe there's like a few times when I would love to see what other people are seeing. And it's not just the fact that I want to, even just like giving us collective oversight of like, here's what the reality across different parts of the US, across different parts of the world looks like, would be an incredible tool for collective intelligence, right? And I think it's just giving us the option at least to break outside of the stuff that we see typically.
You could even
you can judge it.
No, I love that. You could even think of it as Google, like you get your page 1 and just maybe at the bottom there is a alternate, here's, you've identified that you want to understand what somebody in this specific kind of bubble or different group would be. And so it's not, you still have your first page, you still have everything, but you have 1 or 2 links that you could then go and explore. And as you said, maybe people don't do it, but maybe they do. And I think there's an aspect of that is really fascinating, particularly as you said, we just got done with elections here in the United States, and we've done a number of episodes where we talked with researchers about political polarization and different things. And the part that was really interesting, one of the pieces was this, we're moving away from a shared reality that everybody is living in their own bubble, their own truths. And by just making that, and that doesn't lead to a good democracy and it doesn't lead to a good society. So all right, off of my soapbox bubble there.
But I do think And even the basic level, right? So even the basic level of recognizing that you live in a totally different reality. I think most people don't understand. Like when I talk to my parents, I don't think they understand that their
Yeah.
Google searches are as personalized as they are. So if you had at least an option that says like that, I like the idea of just having two at the bottom, right? You see, okay, this looks totally different. So maybe I'm just going to poke around a little bit more and see where those differences come from. So I think even
Yeah.
this first step of making it more visible that we don't see the same thing, I think would go a long way of hopefully regaining some of that shared reality.
Yeah, thank you. What lies ahead, Sandra? What does the future hold for how our digital footprint is being handled and used? Should we be excited about it? Should we be scared? You know?
Maybe a little bit of both. I mean, I think it very much depends on it. Again, it's like very similar to the village. It had these both sides, and it was very much how good were you at playing the game. And I think what is important was important back in the village, important now in the context of our digital lives, is first of all we need to understand how the game is played, right? Just kind of giving basic levels of literacy of like, here's what your data can be used for, making it more transparent for people of what companies are collecting and what they're using it for, as we've seen in some of the more recent regulations. But for me, the main question is really, and you see this also kind of come out in regulation, is the silver bullet that we typically see being suggested is, well, just give people control. Now, the problem is that this is a hell of a difficult task to do, right? So it's not just that we don't know exactly what's happening, and technology moves so fast, right? I do this like for a living. I do this 24/7 pretty much, and I have a hard time keeping up in how
Yeah.
fast technology is evolving. And even if you do keep up, it's a full-time job, right? So there's like, you have better stuff to do. So if we think really about what lies ahead in terms of amplifying the good and hopefully mitigating some of the bad, I think we need better solutions. One is, at least the way that I've been thinking about this, and it might be helpful because it really helped me kind of think about this control thing, is I've been comparing it to like you being in charge of your own sailing boat. Sounds great, right? You being the captain of your boat, making all of these decisions, calling all the shots is amazing if you're in the Mediterranean Sea and the sea is calm, it's great weather, all of the places that you can go to are wonderful. You can only make good choices. In that case, being in charge of your boat is great. But that's not the environment that we're in. The environment that we're in is like this raging thunderstorm, a gazillion emergencies at the same time. You don't know what you're doing. And so now being the only person in charge of your boat is not doesn't really feel like a ride. It feels like you don't know what to do with this. So based on this metaphor, there's two things that I think we need to do again to make it easier for people. One is taming the sea, and I think of that as regulation, right? You make it harder for companies to abuse data and easier for people to do the right thing. That could be as simple as imposing a data tax, right? So right now, it's pretty much free for companies to get a hold of as much as they can. And as we kind of discussed earlier, the more data you can collect, the more valuable it gets because you get the full picture of who someone is. You can also make it easier for people to do the right thing when they manage their data. So switching the default from you sign away your data when you kind of sign up for a product to, well, I have to intentionally consent to some of these individual data points being taken. And now companies have to convince me that they're actually doing a good job at using the data and making my products better. So that's how I think about the taming the sea part. But there's obviously, first of all, like regulation is super slow. It's really difficult to enforce. And the last part is that it also usually just kind of trying to mitigate risk, right? So it's trying to make sure that on average, our data isn't abused, but it's not really helping people make the most of their data. So if we kind of go to these positive what if use cases, regulation is not trying to help you maximize your mental health, maximize some of the goals using your data. And there, I think what you want is, again, coming back to the sailing metaphor, is essentially a competent crew. So it's like a group of people who have similar interest in data that are there to help you and make the most of it. So the example that is near and dear to my heart and top of mind is expecting moms. So I had a baby 10 months ago, and the experience of pregnancy is pretty terrifying because you get advice from all different angles, most of it totally contradictory. You see your doctor 4 weeks, like every 4 weeks, and what you want is like a minute to minute update of here's what you should be doing. based on my genetics, based on my medical history, based on my biometric data, based on everything that's happening in my social circles, and do that minute by minute. Now, if you could pool all of your genetic data, medical history, biometric data in one place, you could probably get these insights, but I don't want a pharma company to hold all of the data. What I want is like other expecting moms who I trust to essentially get together under like governance structures like data corps or data trusts. They're membership owned, right? So they're member owned. So essentially everybody who's in the data corp owns the data corp. And now because it's many of us, we can actually put experts in place who can do some of the management for us, right? So maybe I don't have a full understanding of how I should manage my genetic data. I don't necessarily know who I can trust to use it, who I cannot trust. But now, because we're maybe thousands of women, we can hire experts in the field whose sole job is to maximize utility for us and try to reduce harm. And now, the same way that we have bankers with fiduciary responsibilities, they would have to legally act in the best interest of us. So I think that's really the next level, right? Taming the sea is like the bare minimum, but helping people make the most of their data, I think, is the next step. And I don't think we can do it alone, but I do think there's like this huge potential of us just coming together as like these small communities of people who have like shared interests in their data.
Okay, collective sigh. There's optimism.
Like
there's hope, right?
Yeah, sometimes it's a co-op model of our digital exactly. components. Yes, I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fantastic. Are you still a Swiftie?
I am. I think it's even in the book somewhere. I still, yes, I was listening to it in the morning, just like when I go for a walk, just like a Swiftie song usually makes me happy. But it also turns out, back to my expecting mom story, I now listen to kids songs all the time. So if you were to kind of grab my Spotify history, you would find like a few Swiftie songs and a lot of Disney songs and like fun little kid songs.
When did your playlist change? At what point did you have a playlist through your pregnancy that was sort of similar to your regular life prior to being a mom?
It's a good question. I think my pregnancy playlist was probably a lot darker. I think my pregnancy playlist was like Linkin Park, and like, how do I get to this shit here?
Wow.
So I think, if you thinking back now, I think it was more like a lot of, you can do this, but life is tough.
So
I love that.
Yeah. Let's imagine that you were able to take a year off and be on a desert island, just yourself, and everybody in your family's fine. Everything gets taken care of, but you get to just go and listen to music, and you get to take two musical artists' catalogs with you. What two musical artist catalogs would you take along?
Oh, that's a great question. I love the fact that the baby's not there, so no kid songs. I do. So there's like this DJ group in Berlin that I love. They're called Karte Blau. So I think I would take everything that they produce. They're amazing. And then I would probably take Taylor. Just for the fun of it.
You're not bringing Linkin Park to do that darker
it's
side.
Like it's just like One Island and Me. Like, how bad can it be?
Oh, I love that. Sandra, one last question. If you could have listeners, the listeners from the show, take away one kind of thing, what would you want to leave them with based upon this? Or another way of maybe thinking about this. Maybe we'll put this in an imaginary perspective. There's an anonymous donor who's going to put 100,000 billboards up around the world, and you get one message to be put on all of those billboards that you get to share. It'll be a long message. Yeah. What is it?
So I would have to ask generative AI to reduce it and make it slightly more catchy. But I think the one message that I really want people to understand is, I think we should all ask for more. So I think there's this very convenient narrative that's been perfectly crafted by Silicon Valley that says either you have to give us all of your data so you can benefit from the amazing products and services and get all the convenience that technology has to offer. But for that, you have to give up your privacy and your self-determination, everything. And I just don't think that's true anymore. I think there's many ways in which we can now keep our privacy, have more control, make our own choices, and still get some of the benefits. So I think just this false dichotomy that's being propagated, which leads many people to say, well, I don't care about my privacy, I don't need it anymore. I think that's just wrong.
Sandra Matz, thank you for being a guest on Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Sandra, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into our technically manipulated brains.
Yeah, this is going to be a downer of a conversation, isn't it?
Well, as we were talking about this before we started just doing this part, yes, it could be. It could very well be. But I think one of the good parts about talking with Sandra is that she has this optimism about what can happen, that it isn't this negative loop that we're just going to become more and more of a big brother society where every single thing that we do is mapped and tracked, and that there's going to be no freedom of choice, and we're just going to be living in a world where every single instance of our lives is controlled by the deep overlord of all right, so there we go.
Okay, Debbie Downer.
It was that Debbie Gibson concert I wanted to go to, but can't anymore,
but never
because
went to.
people would be knowing that I did. Yeah.
We're going to have a link to Debbie Gibson so that people who don't know that she ever existed will have to suffer from her.
Oh no! Come on, she was a one-hit wonder in the.
She did.
She
had a hit. Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't even remember what it was, but there we go.
I don't know. It's all sugary. It's like saccharin to me. I know.
Yeah. See, there's upsides. There you go.
Sugary. Okay. Fun. Well, let's get the downsides out of the way. Let's because
but we could spend hours on the downsides, Tim.
And let's not.
All right. That's a good idea.
But this idea of psychological manipulation is scary in the world that we live in.
Yeah.
Because we just don't know. Because as I'm an institutionalist, I believe in the institutions. And when someone comes in and says our institutions are all wrong, that we have to upset all of our institutions, and I'm talking about the president-elect at this point, that it concerns me that I don't believe that all of our institutions are perfect by any means, actually, not even close. But I also believe that institutions are best remedied by working through the institution, not just coming in and upsetting the apple cart, not just turning it over or turning it upside down or just ending it. And so living in a world where we're tracking all this data, there are people out there that I consider might be bad actors, and want to use this for some kind of psychological manipulation.
Well, and I think on that, Tim, the part that scares me in this Big Brother kind of not being a side, because I think there's actually a component there, is we had all of these conversations, regardless of this election cycle in the US, we had the conversations earlier or last year and then earlier in this year. We're at the end of 2024, folks. And so this might be coming out in 2025. But we had those conversations with the political scientists and the economists about political polarization and, democracy, under threat. And I think there is this aspect of autocratic societies and governments who see this as a tool for them to stay in power. And by being able to manipulate both psychologically, but also in the fact of just being able to monitor and to track and all of that residue that is out there, those the technology footprint that you have left is out there, can be really scary if we think about it. So I think that's one big piece. But the other one, in going back with your psychological manipulation, is not necessarily bad actors even. It's businesses who
are just using these tools to try to sell us those goods that they are trying to sell. And to your point, the bad actors, it might not even be in bad faith. They're just trying to, sell their goods the best way possible. And it may mean that we buy things that we don't need because they're tapping into a psychological need that we didn't even realize was there.
This gets into the fundamental question of, to some degree, are we better off with a bit more government regulation to help curve the systematic issues versus the opposite, which is we want to lean more towards the individual responsibility and consequence taking on an individual level. Just give me all my damn choices and I'll choose how to live, versus we know that we have foibles on an individual level, and we can and we're better off. We as a culture, as human beings overall, are better off with some regulation out there.
Well, that's the neoliberalism, right? That give me the choice. And the fact of that, I tend to agree with that most times. However, I think there are limitations on that, and particularly when the manipulation is happening at a level that we are not aware of. And this is the big thing that's already happening, where it's happening in our advertisements that we see in a magazine or on a billboard or on television. And it's not necessarily just with what we're going to be having from, the Amazons of the world or the Googles or online pieces or the social media pieces that come into this. But it is at a level that I think is significantly higher, that it goes to 11, Tim. That's basically all I'm going to say.
I would beg the question of how much autonomy do you have when you make any buying decision? I know that I went to the grocery store to buy eggs, and so that was my intention. But I came home with a basket that was $115 worth of stuff.
Now, wow, eggs are expensive these days, man.
Right. So how much of that was influenced by advertising that I saw in the store? How much of it was influenced by, the blueberries are on sale? How much of it was influenced by how hungry I was at the time? All of those factors, I think, diminish our ability to be completely free thinking. And I'm going to play Sapolsky on this, that we just don't have as much, we have some agency in making decisions in the moment, but I think we have a lot less than we give ourselves credit for. And especially this neoliberalism argument that, just give me all the choices and I'll make the decision and then I'll suffer the consequences, I think is incredibly narrow-minded.
I would agree. And to your point, I think we are constantly, and we have always been constantly influenced by the context that we are in, by our own emotions, by a variety of other things. And we have, since the dawn of us coming together in groups, we have been manipulated, and I will use that term, in this way, by others because they want something and they can manipulate us in order to get that. The scary part for me is at the scale which this can now be done and at the kind of precision that it can be done. All right, let's just get off this negative Debbie Downer. Let's talk about some of the upsides that Sandra was talking about, because we could really spiral down that too long. Yeah.
Absolutely. But here's the upside is, I like the fact that there's an automation to a lot of things in my life. I like the idea. I benefit from all of that. I'm happy that I get promoted things from an advertising perspective that are more or less relevant to me. I don't need to see ads for products that have absolutely no relevance to me. I'm actually kind of glad that there is some filtering going on before those ads get to me based on the digital footprint.
Right. And what's funny is that I have become more
upset when I get the ads that aren't aligned to me, right? When you do see something that isn't in at least a peripheral kind of go where, oh yeah, I'm not really interested in that today, but I could see where I might be, versus why the hell am I being shown these ads for, baby wipes? I don't, you guys should know my kids are 15 and 18 now. They're not, I don't need freaking baby wipes. Right. But that's an interesting part of how we've evolved too. And that piece of it. So yes, I do agree. And I love the fact that I can look up any information at my fingertips, as much as sometimes it's a pain in the ass, but having conversations with my kids and they're asking me something, I go, I don't know. Why don't we look it up? Freaking fantastic. It is fantastic that we can connect with people everywhere around the world. It is fantastic that we can have a conversation like we just did with Faisal Naru in England, and that we have that at like this, right? I mean, all of that. There's a lot of benefits, and we're not, Luddites and say we need to go back to, the days of horse and buggies.
Like Sandra's, the experiment that she talked about where they differentiated introverts from extroverts in the way that they were trying to help people save. And so the messaging was different for the extroverts than it was for the introverts. Like, bring it on. Like, I think that's a fantastic, it talk about manipulation or influence. I think that's a terrific application of using that digital residue, that digital exhaust, to help us understand how can we help people be their better selves.
All right. Again, this comes into, we're making assumptions that savings is better than spending.
We are.
And we're putting those intentions upon others. So the neoliberals will be going, well, no, I should be able to make my own determinate, right? But to that degree, I think there is some aspects where we can generally say, this is a better outcome than the other outcome. And if we can nudge, I don't like that term given, the things, but if we can influence more people to make that decision, then it's probably a good thing across the societal aspects that this is in.
Right.
I don't know. People can, if you disagree, listeners, let us know, send us nasty comments. We'd love those. Join our Facebook group and post a rant about Kurt and Tim, you're wrong, because we might be. We're not saying we're actually absolutely 100% perfect on this. So,
I wanted to relate a story. In 1995, I was at a computer show in Las Vegas called Comdex.
Okay.
It was the computer Dex. I don't know. It was
1995.
A long time ago, right?
Number one was, I don't know what was the top charts of that day.
I have no idea, actually. But in 1995, Bill Gates came out on stage, and Windows had been around for 4 or 5 years, or so, I think, by that time. And he had a movie. He had the Microsoft team create a short movie, like a 20-minute movie or so, about life in the future. And it wasn't this crazy future, like, 21,000 years into the future.
No flying cars, no Jetsons, robots, cooking our meals and cleaning our houses. And
no crazy things like watches that could, you could tell, not just tell time with, but also communicate with. Nothing like crazy like that. But, but the cool thing about this movie was that all of the technology that he revealed in the movie was actually not in production, but available in 1995. So the world that he was presenting in 2005, 10 years later, actually wasn't. No new technology needed to be invented. He wasn't saying if we could just do this. It was really just when we just put this into production. And it was like contactless payment systems, video screens in the cars with video calls, GPS. I mean, remember a world without GPS, right?
Oh, I remember it really well.
Digital maps, touch screens, all these kinds of things, digital recording of television programs. healthcare records and imaging, all of this stuff was brought into this. And the point was that we could actually anticipate, my point in this is that we could anticipate the downsides, because all of this came from knowing specific things about who you are. There was like digital tracking was built into these technologies
right
away. And we could anticipate what the problems is. And part of the issue that I have is that I don't think we did a good job of thinking through the consequences of gathering all that information.
You know why, Tim? Because they didn't
humans?
have a freaking behavioral scientist on their team.
That's
because they were all technologists, and technology is good. And the more that we can, they weren't thinking of the unintended consequences, or that's the blanket statement. If they were, and they probably were, they weren't necessarily thinking of them through a behavioral science lens, a psychology lens, the larger societal impact that has on trust and morality and all these other factors that come into play. So, all right, back off my soapbox. Keep going.
So when I think about these digital breadcrumbs, AI, we are at the cusp of an explosion in AI. It is, maybe we're not in the cusp, it is exploding.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've got these opportunities, if we're going to build AI into products and systems, things like that. Let's get the behavioral scientists at the table, as you say. Let's make sure that we start to think about the consequences of behavioral science, of the applications on our behaviors and how people feel about things and how it will change our culture, change our norms.
Yeah. And this is, as we know, very difficult because it's the race to the top. And so because we don't necessarily have a world body that is overseeing this, the argument against any control or any limitation on this is, well, if we don't do it, somebody else will, and they're actually even worse and more bad actors than we are, and the consequences are going to be even worse down the line. And there's truth to all of this, which makes this not fun, not easy. But yeah, I agree with you, and I don't want to manage my digital footprint being my full-time job. I have other full-time jobs, so I don't want to have to think about that. But that's the world where potentially we're moving into, and that scares me.
Unless your job gets replaced by AI, and then you'll have a lot of time left on your hands to manage your digital footprint.
There's already, who was somebody I saw, John, oh my God, why am I drawing a blank on his name? Comedy guy that we've worked with.
John Sweeney.
John Sweeney has a podcast that's coming out where he's interacting with an AI version, a person who knows his stuff, who's trained on his thing. So Tim, you're going to get rid of me and you're going to get a better AI version of me that doesn't forget people's names. And, I'm
already working on it.
Doesn't do, and kind ofs and ums.
Okay. Let's switch over to a bit of hope.
Okay.
Sandra's idea about the digital co-ops, I think, is a really cool idea that needs to be explored. This idea of let's get a whole bunch of people in the world who have a very similar experience or trait or belief in specific things, and allow marketers to go after those groups of people rather than me as an individual. Right.
Well, it's not even that the marketers are going after those groups. It's the learnings that I can get from those groups. It is the collective wisdom of the groups. It was the promise of the internet, I think, at the beginning. It was this idea that the whole world is now open for us so that the brightest and smartest of us will rise to the top, and I will be able to learn things from all around the globe, as opposed to this pinpointing of our little,
cohort groups that are very, very tight and like, we only believe this. I mean, co-ops are self-selected groups that you can go into and bring. And I love this idea of sharing that data so that we can learn from other new moms, that we can learn from, people who are nearing the end of their typical career and what we do in the moving into the next, part. Or for me, I mean, I had cancer. And so can I, get into groups who have been through the type of cancer that I've had, and what can I learn and understand so that I'm better informed?
Good point. We covered the key points. Okay.
I think so. I think that wraps up those key points. I'd like to say, just with this on a wrap up, is that Sandra's book, Mind Masters, is a really good read. It provides some meaningful ways to think about how we show up online and about our digital exhaust.
Yeah. If you'd like to hear more about this particular topic about digital exhaust and stuff, check out April Seifert in episode 24. 24. Wow, that was a long time ago, where we discussed digital exhaust and gender stereotyping. It was a really cool conversation.
Yeah. And we should note, any effort to stay off of the digital grid in today's highly interconnected, crazy world is probably going to be in vain. And again, not to leave on a downer, but this is it. But what we can do is we can be thinking about how we can take reasonable precautions. And when you can, do that and try to be thoughtful about who you share data with, what that data is, what you're doing out there.
Yeah. Also, I think that we can build for a better future. If you're inspired by Sandra's idea to create digital co-ops, to share aggregated data rather than just personal data, and you have a passion for this area, you might even have some skills in this area, put your brain to work on solving some of these massive or wicked problems. That would be really good for our world.
Right. And or just join our Facebook group and the Groove community out on Facebook and share those ideas with us. It's almost like our own little digital co-op. And we can be the behavioral science co-op that helps us understand all of our human nature and behaviors and all of that by just joining the Facebook group. It's real easy. Go out to Facebook, go search for, Groove community, behavioral grooves community, and join us, because we would love to get your voice out there as well. Yeah. And with that group, as I can see Tim's face, is like, oh my God, Kurt, that was corny as hell. But there you go. That's
but
me.
It works.
Yeah, it's a digital residue that is out there forever now. There we go. With that, Groovers, we hope that you can put some of the insights that you heard in today's episode to use and use them this week as you go out and find your groove.